reasons we need to do NDP. We have to do NDP 14 first. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, we considered it after.
Yeah, we have to do NDP 14 first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this has to do with the cultivation provisions of this bill, where the proposal is to permit every household to have up to 4 cannabis plants, but to a maximum of 100 centimeters. And in short, it's the New Democrats' proposal that we eliminate the height restriction of 100 centimeters. And we do so based on the evidence that we heard before this committee, logic, respect for police officers' time, and good policy making. There is no clear policy goal achieved by limiting the plant height to 100 centimeters that we heard, other than there was some oblique reference to the average height of a Canadian's fence is 4 feet or something, which I'm not sure that's correct. I actually think that fence height is higher than that in Canada, but that was the only reason that we heard, in addition to one that was completely inaccurate, which was in fact repeated by the Minister of Justice, of all people, who suggested that the reason behind restricting the height limit of cannabis plants is to control yield. Now, of course, the reason that that's wrong is we had Dr. Jonathan Page, the botanist from the University of British Columbia, who testified that height restrictions don't restrict yield because the shorter indica type plants tend to produce a higher yield than the taller sativa types. So, and of course, with pruning and having plants going sideways, you could have quite enormous plants that are not more than 100 centimeters. So there's simply no connection between plant height and yield. This plant height is easily circumvented by screening, horizontal growing, and very difficult to enforce. Many Canadians are growing cannabis in their houses now, whether it's a plant in a closet or a few plants, or in some cases all the way up to highly illegal grow operations in basements that are concerning to everybody. But it's very difficult to enforce what Canadians do in the privacy of their own home. We think that measures to reduce the visibility of plants grown on private property are best dealt with by municipal bylaws, not criminal law. So perhaps there could be municipalities who pass laws on screening. If you're growing in your outdoor backyard, maybe there can be plant screens or something around it. But to have an arbitrary limit of 100 centimeters is simply not logical. This measure will continue to impose the harms of criminalization on individuals for what is essentially a harmless act. If you're not a criminal for growing 4 cannabis plants up to 99 centimeters, it's hard to understand why you're a terrible criminal for growing a plant to 101 centimeters. I'll read some of the testimony we heard. Jonathan Page said, from the UBC Department of Botany, that the limit of 100 centimeters is potentially problematic from the perspective that cultivators might break the law simply by providing fertile soil and water and then going away for a week's vacation. Their plants might grow from 95 centimeters to 105 centimeters during that time. I wonder what the goal of the 100 centimeter limit is, which was also contained in the Legalization Task Force report. Is it to reduce the amount of cannabis that each Canadian is capable of growing so they don't go on to sell it? Or is it to reduce the visibility of plants grown on private property? If it is the latter, I think this is dealt with by municipal bylaws. If it is the prevention of diversion to the so-called black market, I would suggest that achieving this through enforced pruning is quite silly, and that the 100 centimeter height limit should be removed. Michael Spratt said, the criminal law power is a very blunt tool to deal with social problems. It's an even blunter tool to deal with gardening problems. When you look at the rationale that has been disclosed for the criminalization of that 1 extra centimeter, looking at fence height, not looking at yield or potency or problems with distribution, that could very well lead to some charter problems with respect to the rationality of that somewhat arbitrary benchmark. And finally, Kirk Tusaw testified that cannabis, particularly outdoors, can easily grow 5 or more meters high in its natural state. Do we really need or want a rule that would require Canadians who wish to grow a few plants in their gardens to continually tie down the branches or otherwise artificially manipulate a plant during its growth to keep it to no more than 99 centimeters high? The 100 centimeter limits are the height of absurdity. Mr. Chair, we heard a lot of testimony from police officers who, contrary to the purpose of this bill, that It's to reduce the burden on the criminal law system. I think the police forces were very, very clear that they see a lot of extra work from this bill. They're going to have to be policing the impaired driving provisions, which are new. They're going to have to be policing 100-centimeter plant limits, over 30-gram possessions in public, over 5-gram possession of teenagers 13 to 18, possession of over 4 plants. I really don't think we want the police officers of this nation to be walking around with meter sticks attached to their holster. So they go into Canadians' houses and measure plants to see if they're 99 or 101 centimeters. So for all the reasons that I've just suggested, and most importantly, for the evidence that we heard, I really hope that all members of this committee can at least agree that the evidence we heard was quite clear. There was not one witness who really said that 100 centimeters was a necessary or highly justified plant restriction. I think if we're going to allow Canadians to grow 4 plants, and I'm in favor of that, I think I congratulate Liberals on having the courage to allow that. I think there's good reasons to allow Canadians to grow a few plants. Primarily, if you want to get organized crime out of this, then let Canadians grow their own cannabis and share it with each other, just like any other plant. Let's certainly let Canadians grow 4 plants and limit it to that, and not have an arbitrary and unjustified height limit that really doesn't make sense.
Thank you very much. Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair. This is one of the most troubling sections of this whole bill, and you know, this is the part where the 88% of Canadians that don't use marijuana are going to be impacted. We heard testimony, as Mr. Davies has said, from the police that said the difficulty of trying to enforce this. They will have chronic complaints, neighbors calling, my neighbor has 5 plants, not 4 plants, my neighbor's plants are too tall. They can't see inside the house, they can't enforce it. We heard testimony about, you know, the smell, the mold that people will have to put up with, the fact that there's 24 times more likely to have a fire because of the bulbs that they're using. We know that we heard you could have up to 600 grams of marijuana hanging around in the house, no provision for lockup. That definitely is not going to keep it out of the hands of children. And so when we look at this and we look at the rights of property owners who are now going to have people that rent from them, able to grow, able to consume right there, and they can't do anything about it, you know, I think this is where this section should have been eliminated altogether. We heard from Washington that the reason they only allowed home grow for people that were too frail to get out to a dispensary for their medical marijuana. The reason they did that, we heard the testimony, is because organized crime does get into home grow. That's what happened in Colorado. That's why it shouldn't have been allowed. This is problematic for all the Canadians that don't want these unintended bad causes. Thank you.
McKinnon.
I agree with Mr. Davies in every respect. However, his motion is incorporated in Liberal 3, which is the one I prefer to support. So on that basis, even though I certainly agree with Mr. Davies' points, well made, I will oppose this bill in favor of Liberal 3. Or oppose this amendment, sorry.
I should point out that if this one is adopted, Lib 3 cannot be moved, so.
Correct.
Mr. Oliver.
Same point that my colleague raised, support the principles that Mr. Davies has put forward, but Liberal 3, in our review of the language, it hits the language better. We have actually the reverse problem, Mr. Davies, between Liberal 6 and NDP 27, where actually the NDP 27 is better language, and we'd be supporting it versus the Liberal one when we hit that one. So I'd be opposing your motion just on a language technicality, not on the principles that you put forward.
Mr. Van Kesteren.
Well, thank you, Chair. And Ms. Gladue, I think, articulated well what I was going to say, so I don't need to repeat what she says. Thanks, Marilyn.
Mr. Davies.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the comments from Mr. Oliver and Mr. McKinnon, and I take it that their motion will also eliminate the 100-centimeter height restriction as well. So I respect that, and I appreciate that they may choose their motion, which it doesn't really matter how we get there, as long as we amend the provision accordingly. I just want to make two quick points. Ms. Gladue did bring up the excellent point that under the current provisions regarding medicinal marijuana, owing to the Supreme Court of Canada decision, that Canadians have the right to grow their own medicinal marijuana now. We heard no testimony about how that may be impacted by this bill. One of the many reasons that I support allowing Canadians to grow a limited amount of cannabis for their recreational purpose is for that very reason, that we could have a two-tiered system where Canadians are growing for medicinal purposes under a claimed constitutional right, and Canadians who don't have a medicinal purpose would be prohibited from. I think what that would lead to is actually a bit of disrespect for the law, because Canadians who want to grow recreationally would then simply claim that they have a medicinal right, which is what's happening now in many respects in Canada. So I think for uniformity purposes, it's important to have a consistent approach to growing cannabis in this country. If medicinal users can grow it, so should recreational users be allowed to. And finally, in terms of the fires and mold, I think my only concern about bringing up those features is that any evidence of mold and increased risk of fires has come from the police experience of dealing with cannabis as an illegal substance, where growing has been done underground and by organized crime. So we have lots of stories of organized crime and people renting houses and filling a basement with 100 plants, cutting into the electricity illegally, not venting properly, because if you were to vent outside the house, you risk detection, which then increases the mold provision. So I'm satisfied that limiting Canadians to grow to 4 plants will mean that those very legitimate concerns about large-scale illegal grow operations won't be applicable, I don't think, to a rational, reasonable limit of 4 plants. I mean, Canadians have more, I bet you your average Canadian has more than 4 plants in their house now. And certainly in their backyards, people have foliage all over the place. So I'm not worried about the mold or the fire problem, at least based on the evidence we heard, for 4 plants in a Canadian household.
Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair. I think we did hear lots of testimony as well about landlords in huge apartment buildings. I am in an apartment building where my next-door neighbor loves to consume cannabis and smoke it, and it smells horribly and is very irritating to me. But that certainly will be one of the problems. The other problem is there's no quality control. If we look at, what this bill was supposed to do, it was supposed to protect the health of young people by restricting their access. Clearly, home grow does not do that. It was supposed to deter illicit activities, and we heard testimony that it doesn't do that. And it was supposed to provide access to a quality-controlled supply of cannabis, and we know there is absolutely no quality control happening in home grows, and for those reasons, it's not consistent with even the goal of the bill, not to mention the fact that I disagree totally with the concept.
Seeing no more speakers, I call for a vote on NDP 14.
I have a recorded vote, Mr. Chair.
Certainly.
Monsieur Ayou, Mr. Yolson, Mr. McKinnon, Mr. Oliver.
No.
Ms. Sidhu.
No.
Ms. Gladue. Mr. Van Kesteren. Mr. Weber. Mr. Davies.
Yes.
Yes pour 1, nays contre 8, 8.
Okay, NDP 14 is defeated. Now we go to Liberal 3. Who wants this? Mr. Oliver?
Okay. Thank you very much. So Mr. Davies, I think, has already articulated quite well what we heard from witnesses in the last motion. This motion basically accomplishes the same ends that his motion did, but with language that is probably more appropriate to the bill. And just to reiterate the main points, we heard from the chair and co-chair of the task force that their reason for recommending height restrictions had to do more with fence height and what we would view, I think, as sort of civil rules, not to do with criminal factors. No other jurisdiction that I think that we heard from has that allows personal cultivation of cannabis plants had a plant height limit. So we just didn't like Mr. Davies can't see a rationale for a height restriction. So the motion essentially removes those restrictions, but puts different wording in replacement. So that's the motion that we're putting forward.
Mr. Davies.
Maybe could I ask Mr. Oliver to explain what the fundamental difference is between his motion and my motion? What does his motion do that is, it adds or subtracts or differentiates between my motion?
I don't know if that's helpful. I think the motion from the NDP basically removed words, and this removes certain words and puts different language in place. And there's a number. I think it's mostly about the numbering associated with it.
Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair. I agree that putting height restrictions on is problematic because we did see evidence of people talking about how plants then would become wide. And I especially remember one of the testimonies that we had where they showed different plants without height restrictions. Some of them looked like trees and had huge yield. And so there doesn't appear to be any limit on how much cannabis people can be growing. And so I will be opposing this.
Seeing no more speakers, I'll call for a vote, but before I do that, there's a note here that says, if adopted, Liberal 6 is also adopted as a consequential issue, and NDP 26 cannot be moved because of a line conflict. So, a call for a vote on Liberal 3. All those in favor of Liberal 3?
Have a recorded vote, Mr. Chair.
Monsieur Ayoub. Mr. Yolson. Mr. McKinnon. Mr. Oliver. Ms. Seydoux. Ms. Gladue. Mr. Van Kesteren. Mr. Weber.
No.
Mr. Davies.
Yes.
Yeas pour 6, nays contre 3.
So it's okay. Okay, I declare Liberal 3 approved.
And 6.
And Liberal 6 as well. That's the way to do it.